Hello and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 577, The Kings of the Ring, Part 4. When Takamiyama won his first Yusho, his first tournament victory back in July 1972, the occasion was historic for a couple reasons. It was, of course, the first and, so far as I know, only time the words of then-President Richard M. Nixon were read atop the dohyo, at least so far. Though actually it wasn't the only presidential run-in that Takamiyama had during his career. In 2009, after he retired from coaching, he received a statement of congratulations from then-President Barack Obama. So I suppose Takamiyama is one of the rare sources of genuine bipartisan consensus in the United States political arena. Must be the sideburns. Beyond the presidential nature of the occasion, however, Takamiyama's win raised an obvious question. He was the first non-Japanese citizen to manage a Yusho in Makuuchi, sumo's top division. Presumably, he wouldn't be the last. And that, combined with the fact of Japan's rising standard of living, which meant fewer and fewer young boys were pursuing careers as rikishi, raised the specter of a future where the pinnacle of what is, by most imaginings, the most Japanese sport possible would be dominated by non-Japanese people. In particular, it suggested that one day the Japan Sumo Association and its attached Yokozuna Deliberation Council would have to consider elevating someone who was not Japanese, but who had attained the required skills and pedigree, to the rank of yokozuna, the highest rank one can attain in sumo. That someone wasn't going to be Takamiyama, frankly. He was 28 when he won that Yusho, very much at the pinnacle of his career, and he was good. Nobody makes the top division at all, let alone wins a tournament there without being good. But he'd never shown the flashes of raw sumo genius that even those who make yokozuna later in their careers tend to come into the sport demonstrating. But even if Takamiyama wasn't going to become a yokozuna himself, he'd shown it was possible for someone who was not Japanese to excel in sumo. Someone with the potential would come eventually. So who was it going to be? Well, it turned out that even if Takamiyama himself would never get the rope, as you call it sometimes, a reference to the tsuna, the braided rope that's one of the markers of yokozuna status, he was going to play an important role in that moment eventually. He would be the one to recognize and recruit the first foreigner with that potential. And that brings us to the story of one Chad Rowan, though if you follow sumo, you know him by his shikona, the name I'm going to use for the rest of this series, Akebono-Taro. And just as a quick reminder, a shikona is a ring name that a rikishi, a sumo wrestler, gets over the course of their career. I'm going to stick again to my usual convention for people known by more than one name, and just use the most famous one consistently, which in this case is Akebono. But I do want to note, particularly for this story, that this is not the name he was born with, and that the process of him getting his name is actually a big part of our story. So, the future Akebono was, like his mentor Takamiyama, Hawaiian. He was born on May 9th, 1969, in Waimanalo, on the outskirts of Honolulu, on the most populated of the Hawaiian Islands, Oahu. He was the eldest of three brothers born to Janice and Randolph Rowan. The Rowans were indigenous Hawaiian, descended from the population that existed on the islands pre-colonization, and like most indigenous Hawaiians, the Rowans were far from wealthy. Hawaii's role as an agricultural outpost for sugar and coffee, and by the 60s as a tourist destination, had made a lot of money for some, but most of that money had gone to white colonists from the mainland United States, who bought up the land and resources used to fuel those industries. Thus, the future Akebono was more than willing to consider a career in professional sports, including sumo. It was, after all, a good way to make money that didn't require a lot of professional connections or education or other things that tend to be the provenance of the well-off. One could, and I'm sure someone has, write an entire book on the ways in which professional sports takes advantage of this sort of economic desperation, often drawing from underprivileged communities to recruit new athletes, since sports is one of the more visible ways to escape poverty. But that's a story for another time. Anyway, Akebono, like his mentor Takamiyama before him, was exposed to sumo by way of Hawaii's Japanese American community. Matches were broadcast consistently on Hawaiian television, and Akebono thus already was aware of and had an interest in the sport. He was also an athlete in high school, playing on his high school basketball team as a center. And he was well suited for that. He was a tall kid from the jump. 200 centimeters when he entered sumo professionally, which is about 6'6", and at his peak 203 centimeters, which is about 6'8". So he really had the build to be successful in basketball, at least as much as I understand this. I'm more of a hockey person. And possibly there's a mirror universe or wherever where that's what he did. However, as he entered college, the future Akebono was not actually looking at sports at all. He was looking at a career in the service industry and actually initially planned to study hotel management at Hawaiian Pacific University, which he got into on a basketball scholarship. But then during his freshman year, a family friend from the local sumo community, Larry Aweahu, a local judo instructor and retired firefighter, introduced him to a man he would come to know as Azumaseki Oyakata, the father of Azumaseki Stable, its leader and primary trainer, but whom Akebono would just call Boss. This was, of course, Takamiyama, who after retirement had left his original stable, Takasago-beya, and set up his own shop at Azumaseki-beya. Larry was actually a distant cousin and had spent time in Japan with Takamiyama back in the late 60s, when Takamiyama himself had been a wrestler. Larry Aweahu had also been the one to introduce Takamiyama to the future Konishiki in 1982, and including Akebono would end up recruiting at least 11 more Hawaiians to sumo that I know of. It's harder to dig into the career of wrestlers who never made Juryo or higher, so I might be missing a few. Acting as a sort of local talent scout for sumo in Hawaii during the 80s and 90s. Takamiyama, being Hawaiian himself, saw Hawaii and the broader Polynesian community as fertile recruiting grounds for sumo and was in Hawaii often to find new recruits. Both Chad Rowan and his younger brother, Ola, fit the bill. Takamiyama was actually concerned at first that the future Akebono was both too tall and too long-legged for sumo, as those things would raise his center of gravity and make him easier to throw, but eventually came around to the idea that the young kid could have promise. It was worth at least giving it a shot. Akebono, for his part, was fascinated by sumo, and hey, if it didn't work out, he could always go back to school. And so in January 1988, Akebono flew to Japan at the age of 20 and entered Azumaseki-beya, if anything, a little on the old side as a recruit totally new to sumo. The way that he would later describe his time there when he was a trainee, I honestly can't think of a better descriptor for it than just brutal. It sounds, frankly, like it was an incredibly hard life. For one thing, of course, Akebono was behind basically all the other trainees. Many new recruits were a few years younger than him, and the Japanese ones had often done club or amateur sumo earlier in life. For another, he was, of course, very much an American teenager of the late 1980s, who was now being transplanted into an environment that was basically antithetical to the Gen X teenager vibe, one where status, authority, hierarchy, and tradition were dominant, and asking annoying questions or criticizing the status quo was, to put it mildly, unwelcome. Akebono would later recall basically getting demolished in many of his early training sessions, being exhausted by the long rounds of shiko, the stomp squats intended to train your core, having his leg joints pulverized by the intense stretches intended to build the required flexibility, getting his butt firmly planted in the dirt during drills, and being unable to move his opponents at all when it came time to practice his tachiai, the charge one opens a match with. To make matters worse, as a new recruit, Akebono was expected to serve the older wrestlers in the stable, who were frankly not great to him. That's not uncommon in sumo. If you're new, you're just expected to put up with that from the older wrestlers as a kind of hazing. The Japan Sumo Association has tried to crack down on this because it's aware that it doesn't make sumo look great as a sport, but has been, let's call it, mixed at best in their success. In the 80s, those anti-bullying initiatives didn't even exist yet. Akebono would later recall that one senior wrestler in Azumaseki-beya, he never named who, was so awful to him that Akebono would later grab a 2x4 out of the trash and threaten to beat the guy if he didn't leave him alone, which thankfully did do the trick. One person Akebono did name as a positive presence in his life during this time was Taylor Wiley, 1 year Akebono's elder, and another Polynesian, a Samoan, who was at Azumaseki Bay to train. Wiley, who wrestled under the name Takamishu Daikichi, had already started his climb up the Bansuke ranks. He was already in Sandanme when Akebono joined, and would climb to Makushita in the next tournament, the highest of the non-full-time paid ranks. Wiley would take it upon himself to get Akebono used to the life of sumo, helping him train, teaching him Japanese, and just generally taking the kid under his wing, something Akebono would talk about with great gratitude later in his life. Wiley himself, though, would never climb much past the higher levels of Makushita. His highest rank was Makushita 2 in March 1989, knocking on the door of the paid Sekitori ranks, but then, during that tournament, he hurt his knee and never recovered, and would retire from sumo in late 1989. He's a great example of how many promising young rikishi make it to the top of Makushita, but no further, but don't feel too bad for him because he would eventually pivot to acting, and do pretty well for himself, in particular as one of the stars of the 2010 Hawaii 5-0 reboot. He actually died just last year at the age of 56. Another person Akebono remembers fondly during this time? Konishiki, the wrestler we talked about last week, who had also grown up in Hawaii, but was of Samoan, not Hawaiian ancestry. Konishiki was 6 years older than Akebono, so they weren't exactly friendly at first, and by the time Akebono joined, Konishiki was already an ozeki, vastly outranking the new recruit, who he didn't pay a lot of attention to at first. But Akebono would remember a joint training session early in his career between Azumaseki Beya and Takasago Beya, where Konishiki crushed 15 opponents in a row during training and launched one into the air for several seconds. He was deeply inspired by the prowess of the ozeki, thinking this was what he could aspire to one day. You might be wondering, what about Takamiyama, the guy who recruited Akebono? After all, Takamiyama was also Hawaiian. He'd come to Japan around the same age that Akebono was now. Presumably he was aware of how hard this all was for the kid. He'd be sensitive to it. But that's not really the impression you get of Akebono's relationship to his oyakata, or as Akebono calls him, boss. In his telling, Takamiyama could be kind, almost fatherly outside of practice, every inch the model of the loving parental figure associated with the archetype of the sumo stable head, but during practice, he became something else altogether, scolding the hell out of Akebono for not getting his legs high enough during Shiko, having him drill until he literally collapsed, and reinforcing his points about the young boy's bad wrestling form with wax from a shinai, a bamboo stick used for sparring in kendo. I can attest from personal experience, those things hurt like hell when you're wearing protective padding. I cannot imagine what it feels like without it, nor frankly do I care to find out. Akebono would insist to his dying breath that Takamiyama recruited him to Azumaseki Beya not because he thought Akebono had the potential to be a future star, but because he was really after Akebono's younger brother, George, or his nickname Ola Rowan. Ola was 2 years younger than his older brother, the future Akebono, but he was also a lot shorter, only 6'2", and at his height 250 pounds, about 188 centimeters, just over 113 kilograms, for reference. In many ways, that's a much better build for sumo than what Akebono was working with, because you've got height and reach without being so tall that your center of gravity is up high. Ola Rowan, however, was still in high school when Takamiyama met the Rowan family, and so, as Akebono tells it, Takamiyama had gone for the taller and more ungainly elder brother. This would hopefully prove to the Rowans that sumo could be good for their kids and encourage Ola to come join his older brother as soon as he graduated from high school. And it would sort of work. Ola would come to Japan midway through 1989 and join his brother in Azumaseki Beya, but given that this episode is about Akebono and not about Ola Rowan, you have probably already put together that things didn't go quite as Takamiyama expected. We'll get to that in the future. In his later recollections, Akebono would later refer to his early days at Azumaseki Beya as, quote, like a prison movie with prison movie food, unquote. He apparently didn't care much for the chanko nabe, the stew sumo wrestlers usually eat, finding most Japanese food a bit lightly spiced and bland for his palate. By his own admission, 3 days in, Akebono found a payphone, remember those, and called his parents to cry, almost giving up and going home. The only thing that kept him going was a burning desire to beat his Japanese counterparts, to prove that they were not stronger or better than he was. But he later told his biographer Mark Panic, whose fascinating book Gaijin Yokozuna is the source of much of these and future episodes, quote, "If I'd known it was going to be like that, I never would have come." Still, Akebono had come and he stuck with it. He would make his Maedzumo debut in March 1988, just 2 months after coming to Japan. Of course, other than Akebono himself, nobody was that excited about his debut. Really, at the time, all eyes were on Konishiki, who was really going through an important moment in both his own career and the history of sumo as all this was happening. You see, every person whose career we've covered so far in this series has been a non-traditional figure, so to speak, in sumo. Taiho was mixed race, Takamiyama was Hawaiian, Konishiki is Samoan. But Taiho was raised in Japan and very familiar with the traditional expectations for a rikishi, with those standards of hierarchy and obedience and calm stoic behavior that are a part of any traditional art in Japan. Takamiyama, meanwhile, had learned those expectations and was willing to play by them. At any rate, he never made it higher than Sekiwake, so he had something of an underdog story to him that made him kind of appealing. Konishiki was never an underdog, and he was not that interested in playing along with the unwritten rules of sumo culture. As Mark Panic puts it, quote, "While Konishiki was bright enough to recognize this new culture's unwritten rules, he was not afraid to question them and was not always interested in following them, as Takamiyama had. Also, unlike Takamiyama, Konishiki initially cared little about the feelings of his hosts, about competing politely by not showing them up in their national sport. He had not come to follow such rules. He had come to win." And win was what he did. As we talked about last week, Konishiki shot up the Bansuke and once held the record for the fastest rise up to the status of Sekitori, a wrestler in the top 2 paid divisions, in the history of sumo. Commentators compared Konishiki to Commodore Matthew Perry and his black ships blasting their way into the shogun's capital of Edo back in 1853, an arrogant foreigner using his unfair advantage, this time his build and size instead of, guns, to bully his way through sumo. Of course, part of the issue here was, frankly, the press. Rikishi are public figures by definition, and it's a lot of pressure for anyone, particularly if they're a non-native Japanese speaker dealing with Japanese language press. A lot of sumo interviews, frankly, are just boring, if I'm being honest. Honestly, one of the worst parts of watching sumo is the wrestler interviews the Rikishi give, because they are so clearly coached to maintain a certain style of public persona and say the same bland things in response to every question. "I am just so humble. I'm here to do my style of sumo, and most of all, I am here to ganbarimasu, to do my best." It's all very formulaic, but Konishiki did not care for the formula, and especially early in his career, didn't follow it much, especially when frustrated. In one interview in 1984, he was asked how he felt about taking on Ozeki and Yokozuna now that he was higher ranked. What you are supposed to say when you are asked a question like that is, "I'll do my best, ganbarimasu." It's humble, it's straightforward, it's reflective of the cultural expectations for a rikishi, a sumo wrestler. Instead, in Japanese, he said, "Ataru yo," something like, "bring him on." And he got a lot of pushback for that, like death threats, an effigy nailed to the outside of a Shinto shrine, a torrent of hate mail. Konishiki would, after this, try to change his image. By the time Akebono met him, Konishiki the Ozeki had embraced more of the cultural expectations of a sumo wrestler. The injury he'd picked up against Kitao, the future Futahaguro, helped humanize him in the eyes of the sumo public, especially given his rapid rehabilitation and the determination he showed to get back in the ring. The Sumo Association itself highlighted these things alongside, of course, his actual match record when it announced that Konishiki had made Ozeki. He'd also become more fluent in Japanese, naturally, and thus more effectively able to express himself. He would maintain later that a lot of his early issues with the press were a result of his own difficulties with Japanese as a language. And of course, he was also older and one hopes wiser by this point, and a bit less eager as a result to pick a fight than young men can sometimes be. Most importantly, perhaps, Konishiki had realized the hardest part of climbing the upper ranks of the Bansuke isn't necessarily your win-loss record, particularly if you're not ethnically Japanese. It is instead meeting the cultural expectations associated with a top-level rikishi, expectations that are bound up with a certain very traditional idea of what it means to be a good role model for wider Japanese society. As another Hawaiian rikishi from this time, George Kalima, whose shikona was Yamato, said in an interview with Mark Panic, quote, "In my life now, there's two of me. There's a Yamato and there's a George. There's two sides. The Yamato side will always, say I'm sorry and back down, but the George side will always stand up for himself. See, I kind of break myself off, because when you do sumo, it's a totally different world. It's a whole different culture. You have to learn it. If you're alone or just with friends, you can be yourself. But in the public's eye, you have to be a sumo wrestler. You have to be Yamato." And by 1988, Salewa Atisanoe had learned better how to be Konishiki, or at least the Konishiki the Japan Sumo Association wanted him to be. But going forward, he would always run up against the question of reputation and character in his pursuit of yokozuna status, though he also proved never able to hit the requirement the Yokozuna Council eventually set out of 2 consecutive tournament victories to get the promotion, so in some ways that question became a little moot. In large part, this was because of the fierce competition Konishiki started to face from what was, in retrospect, probably one of the peak eras of modern sumo. Akebono, of course, would soon be a part of that competition, but not to get too deep into spoiler territory here, he was actually one of 3 future yokozuna who all made their debut doing Maizumo together in the March 1988 tournament in Osaka, all of whom would play a big part in denying Konishiki's aspirations to be a yokozuna. The other 2 are in fact 2 of the most unique stories in modern sumo, and a story we can't really avoid as a part of this because their careers are very bound up with Akebono's, Wakanohana and Takanohana. I don't want to get too deep into the weeds here because it's not directly related to what we're talking about, but it's too good of a story to pass up, and it is related to Akebono's. So, Wakanohana and Takanohana were not in fact the first to wrestle using those shikona. The 2 brothers were from what you can really call a sumo dynasty. The first Wakanohana, born Hanada Katsuji in 1928, was a longshoreman from Hokkaido who was scouted during a Jungyo promotional tour by Nishinoseki Beya, the same stable which a few decades later would scout the future Taiho in Hokkaido. I guess they really liked pulling talent from the northern island. Wakanohana I, as he's sometimes called, would go on to have a wild career. Among other things, he would go on to have one of the longest single matches in the history of sumo, 17 minutes, though that's not actually the record, 32 minutes is, and become the sport's 45th yokozuna. Despite being pretty small for a sumo wrestler, just 105 kilograms and 179 centimeters, or 231 pounds, 5 foot 10.5 inches if you prefer, he had an amazing career record of 595 wins in 844 matches before his retirement in 1962. Not for nothing did he earn the nickname Dohyo no Oni, the Devil of the Dohyo. And by the way, sharp-eared listeners will note that if Wakanohana retired in 1962, that means he overlapped a bit with Taiho, but they were from the same stable, and you don't usually wrestle people from your own stable or your own relatives, unless it's a playoff to determine the winner of a tournament, because the temptation to match fix is considered a little too high. After his retirement, Wakanohana, of course, started his own stable, called Futagoyama Beya, which confusingly is totally unrelated to the current Futagoyama Beya. It's complicated, we don't need to get into it. And one of his best trainees, an Ozeki, was his younger brother, who took the ring name Takanohana. The Wakanohana and Takanohana whom Akebono debuted with in 1988 were the children of this Takanohana, and the nephews of Wakanohana, who by 1988 had become the chairman of the Japan Sumo Association. And just as an aside, when they first started wrestling, the two brothers did not use the more famous names of their father and uncle, respectively. They adopted those when they attained higher rank, which is pretty common for people with a family history in sumo. They'll start off making their own name, quite literally, and then adopt the name of a famous relative when they prove they're worthy of it. Just to keep things minimally confusing, I'm going to stick to their most famous names. Anyway, there's clearly a reason why the younger Wakanohana and Takanohana were, when they were in the middle of their debut, called the Princes of Sumo by some in the Japanese press. I do also feel obligated to note that in addition to Akebono, Wakanohana, and Takanohana, a future Ozeki, Kaio also made his Maidzumo debut in March 1988. It's an insanely stacked roster any way you slice it. Anyway, Wakanohana and Takanohana in particular are worth talking about a bit more. First of all, just because of how famous their story is. Early on, the two brothers were both considered phenoms. They shot up the Bansuke pretty quickly, with both of them making Ozeki in January 1993. But then a clear separation started to develop between them. By 1995, Takanohana was a yokozuna, having won 4 of the last 6 tournaments. Wakanohana, meanwhile, was stuck at Ozeki and had almost dropped his rank due to a host of injuries. Also that year, the two did meet for their first and only bout together in the November 1995 tournament as a tiebreaker to determine the Yusho, the winner of that tournament. Wakanohana, despite being behind his brother in terms of career record, managed to win. Takanohana apparently never really got over this, and things got a lot worse a few years later when their father had died. By now, both brothers were yokozuna. The older brother, Wakanohana, did finally manage it in 1998. But Takanohana, despite being the younger one, really got into it with his older brother over who would be the chief mourner at their father's funeral and, in particular, take over their father's stable. Both those roles would traditionally go to the older brother, but Wakanohana hadn't really stepped into the traditional roles expected of the older brother of the family. He'd actually left sumo to pursue an abortive career in American football, getting signed to the indoor football team, the Arizona Rattlers, but so far as I know, never playing a snap in that league or making it to the NFL. The brothers had a very acrimonious split over this question of family succession, and Takanohana, despite being the younger one, did end up taking over the role, the stable, and eventually a position in the Japan Sumo Association. Wakanohana, meanwhile, occasionally commentates for sumo broadcasts, but at least in the public eye, his relationship with his brother is to this day non-existent. Of course, nobody knew this was coming in March 1988, and when the brothers first met Akebono, who would be one of their professional rivals, and whose career in many ways surpassed both of them, well, nobody knew that was coming at the time. In fact, during their debut, nobody really paid attention to Akebono at all. The press was there to see the Hanada brothers. Wakanohana and Takanohana were the crown princes of sumo. The assumption was that in Maidzumo, they were the story of the tournament. And if you're wondering what Akebono's reaction to that was, well, apparently he was so annoyed that he took some of the press coverage of the brothers, cut out photos of them, and taped them to the wall of his sleeping area in Azumaseki-Beya. They were no better than him, he would later say, and yet they were the ones getting the press and the attention, and Akebono was a competitor. He was not just going to take the assumption that they were more deserving than he was lying down. Even years later, talking to his biographer Mark Panik, he said much the same thing. When Panik asked what he thought of the brothers, Akebono's response was, "They're the enemy." Of course, saying that's all well and good, proving it's something else. His first round of Maidzumo went well enough, but really, the March 1988 tournament is important to us, less in terms of results and more because it's where Akebono finally got his name. Remember, Rikishi are given a shikona by their stable's elder, in this case Takamiyama, but at first the one Takamiyama picked out for the boy was just Taikai. What that name literally means is wide ocean, a nod to the boy's background, and reflective of the naming conventions of the stable. Most stables tend to have a character they put in all their shikona, and for Azumaseki-Beya it was either Taka or Tai. But it was also a pun of a sort on takai, tall, a reference to his massive 6'8" frame. Such tall people are of course a rarity in Japan. As a taller guy myself, though I'm not Akebono's height, I can confirm you will get weird remarks about how tall you are. People will stare, and it will just be kind of uncomfortable sometimes. And a shikona that's just a pun on tall isn't going to help with that. However, after each tournament, stables tend to throw celebratory parties, and if you're a fan, you can actually go. Most stables have what are called koenkai, supporters associations, or more loosely translated fan groups. You can donate to the stable through these, among other things, to get tickets to the after party and meet your favorite wrestlers. It was at the after party for March 1988 that Akebono would meet a fan who gave him his forever name, so to speak. That supporter was a businessman named Hagiwara Tsunehiro, who would go on to become something of a father figure to Akebono, a financial supporter of the future yokozuna, but also someone he genuinely liked and trusted. Hagiwara, when he met the gangly 19-year-old sumo rookie who a few months earlier couldn't even say dohyo, didn't just dismiss the kid as a helpless newbie. He saw potential and told Takamiyama that a jokey, pun-like shikona like taikai was unworthy of the kid. Hagiwara was, of course, impressed by how tall Akebono was, but not just at a superficial level, in the way someone else would have just remarked, takai na, he's so tall, and then just laughed at the shikona. Hagiwara later told Mark Panic, quote, when he, Akebono, stood up, it seemed like he would never stop rising. It was like the sun was coming up in the early morning. And so Hagiwara suggested a new shikona, a single character that just means rising sun, Akebono. Armed with his new name, Akebono would begin his ascent up the Bansuke proper in the next tournament, May 1988, when he entered with the rank of Jonokuchi 19 East. Early on, by his own recollection and that of his elder Takamiyama, things were a little shaky. His height and size gave him power, but it also meant, just like Takamiyama feared, that he was vulnerable to faster or more flexible opponents who could get under his center of gravity or use his long limbs as a fulcrum for throws. But at the lower levels of sumo, he could take advantage of power. Just like Konishiki before him, he could just slam into his opponents and blast them away with his size. In his first tournament, he went 6-1, mostly by being able to win at what's called the tachiai, the opening charge at the start of the match, just knocking into his opponent and at the same time slapping them to disorient them, and then shoving them clear out of the ring with tsupari, thrusting of the hands. The only match he lost was against an opponent who was able to absorb that charge and get in on Akebono's mawashi, his belt, just to throw him like Takamiyama had feared. But 6-1 is still a pretty good opening record. Even better, one of those wins had been against Takanohana, whom Akebono had been able to beat with a single charge and a few thrusts to the jaw and chest in a matter of seconds. Even a decade later, when he was a yokozuna, he called that one of his most important career wins, proving he was just as good as one of the crown princes of sumo. Thus would begin Akebono's climb up the Bansuke. Starting at this point, he would post a series of continuous winning records, the worst one being 4-3, but most being either 5-2 or 6-1, climbing steadily up the ranks until by the first tournament of 1990, he was Makushita 2 East, the very top of the lower Bansuke, just under the so-called Sekitori, the full-time pros in Juryo and Makuuchi, who are the elite of sumo. He'd built up a stable of supporters, including both Hagiwara Tsunehiro and a small host of American expats in Japan, of whom the most prominent, another surrogate parent, was Dr. Bob Beveridge, a longtime expat and veteran sports fan. I actually found some interviews Dr. Beveridge gave before he met Akebono to the New York Times, talking to American correspondents about a growing interest in American football in Japan. Beveridge is an interesting guy. He was a long-term expat who first came to Japan during the Korean War when he was stationed there and pretty much stayed ever since. We'll talk about him more next week. By his own recollections, Akebono apparently thought Beveridge was kind of an ass, but Beveridge was also, as an inveterate sports fanatic, willing to coach the young Rikishi in how to take advantage of his bigger frame for sumo. Which is certainly not traditional, a coach outside of your stable. But would it be enough to carry Akebono into the Sekitori ranks and beyond? Well, we'll find out next week. For now, that's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com. You can also support the show on Patreon. Special thanks to new patrons Tracy and Christopher for donating to support the show. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week for part 5.